ask you some questions.
You're going to lay some miracles on us, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and my question was essentially with respect to discussions about miracles, and I would argue that the position that many skeptics hold, and I believe I've heard you, certainly Matt Dillahunty, on this show, would make the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and as such, if there's any possible natural explanation, then this must be more probable than a supernatural explanation. And my concern...
I'm not sure that I would add that last part. I'm good with the first part, and I've definitely heard that, but the issue with supernatural explanations I would have further problems with, but please go on.
Okay. Yeah, I guess this was with respect to David Hume, who I know has been cited. And the concern I had with that argument is it seems like it essentially presupposes against any possibility of a supernatural cause at all. So an example I'd give is if today...
well, here's the thing, though. Before you give an example, I'll agree with you. I mean, you don't even have to convince me of this. I think that you're correct. Here's how I kind of view that. Do we agree that nature exists?
Yes.
So things that exist can be the cause of other things, right?
Yes.
And we would probably agree, and I'm not saying that supernature doesn't exist, but we would probably agree that things that do not exist cannot be the cause of other things, right?
I would agree with that, yes.
Okay. And so currently, we don't really know or have a way to measure or examine supernature to confirm its existence, right? Correct?
Not in a scientific manner.
Well, and we're talking, though, about claims and evidence, which I think claims and evidence would be, you'd have to be able to have some sort of metric for what it is you're looking at as evidence, wouldn't you?
Yes, but...
Okay.
Some way to observe.
I think that supernatural evidence isn't necessarily going to be the kind of thing that's going to be testable and repeatable. But what we do have is historical evidence in terms of eyewitnesses to these accounts. So I think I would agree that if you're talking about evidence in a strictly scientific sense, then yes, we wouldn't be able to show things that would demonstrate to a high probability the existence of a supernatural realm. On the other hand, I think if you look at a lot of eyewitness testimony, and Dr. Mike Licona did a really good job of this in his debate with Matt Dillahunty, is that I think there are a lot of good, solid eyewitness accounts, and I think that is evidence in and of itself of a supernatural realm.
You think there are a lot of eyewitness accounts of what?
Of miracles of different sorts. So in the debate with Matt Dillahunty, he was talking about eyewitness accounts, both of miraculous healings and then also near-death experiences in which somebody in an out-of-body experience had heard information about a loved one or knew something about them that that person had never told them. They would have had no way of knowing otherwise.
How do we know they would have no way of knowing?
Well, I suppose we couldn't demonstrate it for sure, but the point is that what Dr. Licona had basically pointed out, where we have these medical cases, I believe he had 300, maybe it was just 30, but they had done interviews of the people who were, affected, the person who had the near-death.
Okay, let me just say that the type of evidence you're describing is extremely inferior. All right, so for example, like you said, this is something that we can't really check. If I like this person, for example, that sent the letter earlier, I don't know if you heard or not, but John was reading a letter and he said somebody sent it to my wife's address. I'm pretty sure John didn't give out his wife's address to a fan to send a letter to her to the show, but somehow this person got it. Now, if information exists and is known to anyone, it could be known to others. We know this. So the fact that there is information, if anybody knows, then it could then leak to anyone else. So the idea that someone has information about someone that they are saying, well, I don't know how they would have known this, or it doesn't seem that there's a way, you really can't know what somebody could know. There are no controls on this type of evidence. And that's what makes it inferior.
Okay, well, I would agree with that. I mean, and that's why this is something that we're having a discussion about. Whereas if we're talking about, whether the Earth was round, there really wouldn't be one. And so I concede that it's not going to be as strong. But I think what we have to do is we have to say that there's two different models of reality. One is a naturalistic model, and one is a theistic model. And then we have these observations. Then we would say which model of reality best accounts for this data.
But the theistic model doesn't account for it at all. I mean, when someone says, this person knows this information and we don't know how, and you say that's a miracle, that doesn't account for it. Like, how does that account for it? In what way did you explain how they knew the information?
The theistic model would postulate that we as humans aren't just material, that we would also have a spirit or a soul, and that there's other dimensions that we can't simply observe. And this would provide the ability for people to have this kind of information, because there's no known natural mechanism by which this could happen.
Okay, this is good. This is good. So then the next question is, how do we test for this?
Okay, so this is where theology starts to come into play. As I think you know, in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, I believe it says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, I think the thing is that I think what God has done, and I think Descartes wrote about this, is that God gives us the evidence so that if it would be sufficient that if we choose to put our faith and trust in him, that we'd have enough of a reason to believe. But he's not going to go out of his way.
This is an excuse for very weak evidence, basically. I mean, basically what you're saying is that there's not compelling evidence, and you just have to make a choice to accept that this is there, even though we can't test for it, we can't put controls on it, we can't demonstrate it. And that's
the whole reason that's
why
in there.
that's why naturalism gets the big weight on the scales of what's a cause.
Okay, well, the thing is that I think it boils down to personal experience, in the sense that
more bad evidence, right? Personal experience is not good.
To those people, it certainly was very real. And my point was that a lot of these experiences would be extremely unlikely to happen under naturalism, and that's why
extremely unlikely, though, it still means the thing can occur.
Well, yeah. And I'm not convinced it's extremely unlikely either.
I'm not even either.
It depends on the specifics.
Someone knowing information that I don't know how they got is not a miracle, and somebody having less pain than they had yesterday is not a miracle. I mean,
okay, well, there are accounts of considerably more dramatic healings, but I guess what I wanted to go to was how this relates to the New Testament. And I think if we take a Bayesian approach to it, saying that if we set a prior probability, say of naturalism versus theism, I would argue that the events surrounding the New Testament, specifically things like the conversion of Paul, the eyewitness accounts to the resurrection, the empty tomb, these things that scholars largely agree upon.
What eyewitness accounts to the resurrection?
Accounts that people believe they saw the risen Jesus. That's what there would be.
Well, I mean, a lot of people believe a lot of things. I mean,
alien abductions.
But you're talking about an eyewitness account. So what eyewitness accounts do we have to the resurrection?
Well, I mean, my point is that we have reports of eyewitness accounts.
We do? Instance, okay, so we have people saying that people saw a resurrection.
Well, we also have, so the four Gospels.
That's not an eyewitness account, by the way. When you say that someone says that people said that they saw this, that's not an eyewitness account.
Right, so I mean, you have Mark, which was written by a companion of Peter.
Who did not see the resurrection.
Well, Peter and the disciples said that they had seen the risen Jesus, or that's what they claimed they had seen. My point was that I agree that it would be stronger evidence if all the disciples had written it directly 1 year after the resurrection. Nonetheless, I would contend that it's still going to weigh heavily.
There are very few people who would, I mean, I would have to even go and look at the verses. I mean, when you talk about Bayesian, right? Richard Carrier did a whole thing on Bayesian theory saying that from a Bayesian perspective, Jesus didn't exist. That if you use the percentages, I'm not that into Bayesian, but I'm just saying if you are, there's a guy saying Bayesian, if you use the Bayesian method, it says that it's more likely Jesus didn't ever even actually exist.
Okay. That's true, but his beliefs are very much on the fringe of the historical.
Regardless, most historians aren't using Bayesian theory to come up with their analysis. I'm just saying if you want to use Bayesian, there's a guy that did it, and he put forward his thesis on Jesus doesn't exist if you use Bayesian. But most historians aren't using it.
I know, but my point is that there's a guy named Dr. Aaron Wall, and he has an article where he uses it. And the difference is that Richard Carrier applies the Bayesian reasoning to whether or not he accepts the historical documents at all. What Aaron Wall does is a little different. What he does is he says, okay, this is what the historical consensus is. And he says he actually takes the liberal view, saying, I'm going to assume the liberal view is true, that half of the letters attributed to Paul weren't written by him, that the Gospels weren't actually necessarily written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just taking them as first century accounts.
Yeah, I don't think any serious historian would believe that those Gospels were written, penned by the people they're attributed to. I mean, even the translators themselves put a preface in before the books to say that, the authorship is unknown, right?
Wait, the authorship, not in the Gospels themselves, it doesn't say the authorship.
No, I'm saying the translators, right? When you open up a Bible that has translation notes, they note that the authors are unknown. That it's tradition, right? It's church tradition that these were the people who wrote them.
That's true, but I'd argue that a lot of them do come up. But I guess the point is that the whole point is that Dr. Wall's analysis was based on the assumption that, okay, we're going to concede the authors, saying that, we don't know who authored Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just treating them as historical documents from the first century. And his argument was that if we do this, if we just take what what a moderate historian would say, that from this, we'd infer in high likelihood that it's more likely than not that theism.
So what we're going to get to at the end here is that different people using the same method came to different conclusions. And what I'm trying to get to is to say that a thing that you can examine and observe as a cause that exists and is confirmed to exist is always going to be the default as opposed to the thing that is not yet demonstrated to exist. You have to actually have a cause that exists for it to be, you have to have a thing that exists for it to be reasonably put forward as a cause. If we can't even get to a point where we can establish the supernatural exists independently, like we can for nature, we're at a quandary. We have to first, if you're going to use the supernatural as the explanation, you have to first demonstrate the supernatural exists. You can't go into this circle where, well, I can't figure out a natural cause for this, or I think a natural cause is highly unlikely, therefore supernature. No, supernature actually has to be demonstrated. It has to be observable and testable and verifiable. Otherwise, we can't say it exists. Otherwise, you're saying, I can't explain this, therefore supernature.
Yeah, that's just an argument from ignorance.
When you say that supernature has to be observable, testable, and verifiable. So if you were to acknowledge that it was possible that there was a God who existed, who wanted people to have faith, so an example would be in the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus says to the Thomas, or is reported saying that, blessed are those, you have seen me. He said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. So if there is a God who has a very strong interest in people having faith in him, but not necessarily having direct observation, if that God does exist, how would your methodology
I would say that there would be no cause to believe in such a God. He would have set up, or that God would have set up a system where he has provided no cause to believe in it.
Yeah, there's no reason to believe in something that you have no
You're
good
basically
reason
saying,
for believing.
what if there was a thing that didn't want to demonstrate itself but wanted to be believed in? How would you find a way to believe in it? And I'm like, I don't feel compelled to find a way to believe in something that doesn't manifest. But what you're saying is it's the same as something that doesn't exist. So how do you prove it exists without being able to show its existence? That is incoherent.
That is
It's indistinguishable from non-existence.
But the thing is that this isn't. This is a very different type of belief. So, if you're talking, this is about something that a lot of the vast majority of people who live on Earth do believe there's a God. That's not saying that it isn't true, but I'm just saying this is some.
That's not a good reason to believe in something either.
No, I mean you know that, right?
Yeah, no, I
get
that in and of itself, but I'm just saying it's a different kind of claim because we can't just state that this is analogous to the tooth fairy because there are a lot of people who claim to have seen miracles directly, and specifically in the New Testament, there are a lot of people who.
Yeah, and there are people who claim to get visions from other types of gods, and there are people who claim to have seen aliens and been abducted by them and had experiences with them and surgeries done on them. And I mean, there's people who make all kinds of claims. But the claim itself has to stand, right? If you can't demonstrate it, it's a useless claim. If you can't demonstrate it, you can't make it be as viable a cause as a thing you can demonstrate. It's not a bias. It's that one thing exists and the other thing we can't demonstrate it exists. And so how can we possibly utilize it as any sort of a cause? All we can do is, using that as a cause is the same as saying X did it. It helps us not at all.
Okay, I guess the concern I'd have with that approach is it essentially says that it would essentially dismiss Christianity out of hand in
it would dismiss any claim that says I don't need to demonstrate it. I can't demonstrate it. I don't need to. You just need to accept it. Yeah, I will dismiss that. Absolutely. I have no problem dismissing that.
There isn't nothing. There is something, but it does require you to
believe it before it's actually demonstrated, and that's not acceptable.
But you would agree that it's not the New Testament isn't no evidence. You'd agree that it's
no. Here's the question. Okay, here's the thing. Some people would say there's crappy evidence and good evidence, and some people would say crappy evidence is not evidence. Depending on how you classify things that aren't compelling as either bad evidence or not evidence, you can label it however you want, but it's not compelling and it's really not useful.
Because there's a lot of old books that say stuff, so you have to have some way of weighing.
A claim is not the evidence, right? The claim needs to be supportable. If I go into court and I start, and I'm giving testimony, you could say, well, that testimony is evidence. Well, what if I start giving testimony that my child was flying around the room and the cat was speaking Spanish? And I mean, at a certain point, even though I'm giving testimony, people are going to say that testimony is useless.
And if it's just one person, I would agree with that.
Even if it was three, I would still be thinking, I don't think the kid was flying around the room and the cat was speaking Spanish. I don't know what these people were taking.
What about 500?
I would still have to say cats don't speak Spanish. I would have to see this. I would really have to get this demonstrated because this defies what we know about reality. And that's the problem here. When you're talking about a thing that we already have established that a cat doesn't have the vocalization skills to speak Spanish, right? And somebody is saying, or even a bunch of somebodies are saying that a cat spoke Spanish, this is aliens abducted me, right? There's tons of people saying aliens abducted them. I do not accept that because it has not been demonstrated. Regardless of the number of people claiming it, it still requires a demonstration at some point, right? Before it to be considered valid and helpful. If we can't examine it and all we have are these people telling the stories, how is this useful until we can actually get into this thing and take a look at it and see what's going on?
Okay, well, the reason I mentioned 500 is that 1 Corinthians was written about 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
Jump in here,
And
John.
Paul writes that Jesus had appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters.
How do you know that's true?
Yeah, it's somebody saying it.
My point is, I'm not saying that we could know this for sure, but I'm saying that this is something that would indicate that it is substantial evidence. The thing that I would...
Anyone can claim 500 people saw something. Anyone can claim that. That doesn't mean if you're going to sit there and take their word that 500 people saw somebody, saw some miracle because they're saying it.
But it's not just that. Paul had a very prominent influence within the early church. He was, an enemy of Christianity, and then he had converted. You'd have to look and say, does this person have good reason to lie? I think I agree this possible.
No, does this person have good reason to be mistaken? That's all it takes. He doesn't have to be a horrible liar. He can just be somebody wrong.
So are you saying he's wrong when he talked to the 500 people?
I'm saying I don't know that he did talk to 500 people. You're saying a claim is evidence. And I'm saying there has to be support for the claim. Anybody can go around claiming anything. Saying 500 people saw this because there's an old book that a guy wrote that he said 500 people saw this isn't evidence that 500 people saw it. Do you understand that?
I agree that it wouldn't. I think it's some evidence, certainly.
It's a claim. Evidence is what supports the claim. All you have is a claim.
I suppose if you were just taking, looking at that at 1 Corinthians in isolation, that would be true. But we also see it corroborated by...
We have more claims, right? This is what it's boiling down to. Okay, wait, we have other callers, and I just want to say where this is going and where this is at, it just seems like what we're rolling around in and going back and forth with is there's not going to be a demonstration. There's these claims, and you take them or you don't take them. There are these things that some people say, I just don't accept could happen naturally, and therefore I'm going to say that instead of saying I don't know what happened, I'm going to plug in this concept of supernature, which tells us nothing really more about what actually occurred. And in the end, you're right, it's a difference in perception. I consider this to be really useless information, and you seem to consider it useful. I appreciate the call, and maybe we can continue that conversation at a later date. I do want to get to some other calls, though. Is that okay? I don't want to...
That's fine. It was a good conversation.
Okay. I feel like we did allow each other to talk a bit about this, and that I'm okay with that, but we could probably go on till the end of the show, and I really don't want to do that because of the other calls, but I hope you feel that you were at least allowed to express.
Absolutely. No, I think you're very polite, and I definitely appreciate the conversation. I think it does show there's just a difference in worldviews in terms of how we look at evidence and what would constitute.
I would agree. There's a difference there. I agree. I think
it's up to the viewers, and I'd encourage them to look at a fellow named Craig Keener, who has a book about miracles where he has basically interviewed people.
And feel free also if you want to go and post to the blog. Like if you there's a show blog, and we have this show thread already up. So if you want to post things there and talk to people about this further, you're welcome to do so. Okay.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Now that isn't to say that you can't design a good experiment to try to demonstrate the supernatural, because like out-of-body experiences, and this has actually been done where somebody's in the hospital and they put they write a random thing on a piece of paper and put it up on the bookshelf up high to test whether if the person feels like they left their body and floated up, can they read what's on this note? And, there's ways of, you have to have a good controlled experiment.
Right, but the problem is, though, this makes assumptions about the nature of supernature. And that's the whole thing. We know nothing about what this thing would even be.
Yeah.
And so when he was describing NDEs, and he was saying, well, these people came back and they knew things about these loved ones, and it's like, this is a one-off. There's no way to control for this. There's no way to, confirm this. There's no way to know what someone knew. What weird
Right.
thing you might have heard 20 years ago.
Yeah, this would be an attempt to control for that. Can they actually see something physically in the room,
Right.
not knew something about somebody that's mysterious?
But what if supernature works in a way that you then have knowledge, but you don't have vision?
Yeah,
So,
then it's
but
special pleading.
we don't have a model of supernature.
Yeah.
It's a big, huge, we know nothing about it.
And even if they could, 100 people could reliably read the note, that doesn't mean it's supernatural. It means we might not have an explanation yet.
Okay.
But
Now this one, you need to jump in. You're making me do all the talking here by not.
I'm not making you do anything.
You need to talk, and I told you that at the beginning of the show. So number 5,